Frank Mercer was 63 years old, sleeping under a highway overpass in Brunswick, Maine, the night he decided that if the temperature dropped 1 more degree, he would simply stop fighting it. His sleeping bag, the only thing he still owned from his old life, smelled like diesel and mildew, and the zipper had broken somewhere around November. That was 4 months ago. Now it was February, and the wind coming off Casco Bay cut through the torn nylon like it was nothing at all. His fingers were so numb he could not feel them against his own face when he tried to wipe the ice from his beard. He had served 22 years in the United States Navy, 2 tours in the Persian Gulf, a Bronze Star that he pawned in 2019 for $40 and a warm meal, a wife named Linda, who left him in 2016 and took their house in Portland, their daughter, and every photograph ever taken of them as a family. The divorce papers came while he was in a VA hospital trying to get his back surgery approved. The surgery never happened, Linda never came back, and their daughter, Claire, who was 31 now, had not answered a phone call from him in 6 years. That is where Frank Mercer was when a letter arrived at the Veterans Resource Center on Congress Street, addressed to him by his full legal name. The woman at the front desk, Rita, had to track him down across 3 shelters and 2 soup kitchens before she found him. She pressed the envelope into his cracked purple hands and said, "Frank, someone knows you are alive." The letter was from a county clerk in a town called Seal Harbor, about 3 hours up the coast. It was 1 paragraph long. It informed him that the Pemaquid Point Auxiliary Lighthouse, a decommissioned structure on a rocky stretch of coast that had been abandoned since 1961, was being auctioned by the state for delinquent property taxes. Starting bid, $800. What caught his eye was not the price. It was the handwritten note, clipped to the bottom of the official letter, written in blue ink that had faded to something close to grey. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, and it said, "This belonged to your grandfather, Gerald Mercer. He would have wanted you to have it." There was no signature. Frank read that note 11 times, standing in the parking lot of the resource center while snow collected on his shoulders. He had never known his grandfather. His father, Carl Mercer, had refused to speak about him. The only thing Frank knew was that Gerald Mercer had been a lighthouse keeper somewhere on the coast of Maine before the automation of lighthouses made men like him unnecessary. He had supposedly died in 1974, the year Frank was born. Carl had called him a fool and a hermit, and said the man had wasted his life staring at the ocean. Frank had $814. It was everything he had, every cent saved from aluminum cans and odd jobs and the small monthly disability check that barely covered the storage locker where he kept a duffel bag of clothes. He stood in that parking lot, the snow thickening, the wind screaming off the harbor, and he made a decision that by any rational measure was insane. He bought a bus ticket to Seal Harbor for $37. The bus dropped him at a gas station on Route 1 at 6 in the morning. The sky was the color of wet cement. The air tasted like salt and pine, and something metallic that he later realized was the smell of frozen seaweed rotting on the shore. He had no car, no phone, and no directions. He asked the gas station attendant, a teenager with acne and a Patriots hoodie, if he knew where the old auxiliary lighthouse was. The kid stared at him for a long time. Then he said, "You mean that thing out on Herring Point?" "Mister, nobody goes out there." The road washed out years ago. Frank walked 4.5 miles along a gravel road that turned to dirt, then turned to mud, then turned to nothing but frozen ruts between walls of bare, skeletal trees. His back screamed at him with every step. His left knee, the one he had injured on the deck of the USS Constellation in 1998, ground like someone had packed sand into the joint. He stopped twice to vomit from the pain, but he kept walking because there was nothing behind him. There was nothing behind him at all. He heard the ocean before he saw it, a low, continuous roar, not like waves on a beach, but like something enormous breathing. The trees thinned. The ground became rock, grey and slick and veined with ice. And then the path ended, and the sky opened up, and there it was. The lighthouse stood at the edge of a granite cliff, maybe 40 feet above the churning water. It was not tall. Maybe 35 feet, a stubby white cylinder with a rusted iron gallery at the top, and a keeper's cottage attached to its base like a barnacle. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing grey stone underneath. Every window was boarded up with plywood that had turned black with age. The front door was a heavy oak slab, and someone had nailed it shut with railroad spikes. The whole structure listed slightly to the east, as if 63 years of Atlantic wind had been slowly pushing it toward the sea. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. Frank stood at the edge of that clearing for a very long time. His breath made clouds that the wind shredded instantly. He could feel the vibration of the waves through the soles of his boots, up through his ruined knee, into his chest. He thought, "This is what they left him. This is what they left me." The auction took place in the basement of the Seal Harbor Town Hall 3 days later. Frank was the only bidder. The clerk, a heavy woman named Donna, who smelled like coffee and printer ink, looked at him with something between pity and concern when he counted out $800 in wrinkled bills on the counter. She said, "You know there is no electricity out there, no water. The road is not maintained by the county." Frank said, "I know." She stamped the papers and slid them across to him and said, "God help you, Mr. Mercer." He pried the railroad spikes from the front door with a crowbar he bought at a hardware store for $11. That was it. $11 was all he had left in the world after the lighthouse, and the bus ticket, and the crowbar. He worked the spikes loose, one by one. The iron was so old it crumbled in orange flakes, and the oak beneath had turned nearly black with moisture. When the last spike came free, the door did not open so much as exhale. A breath of air came out of that building that smelled like dust and salt and something else, something sweet and old, like dried flowers sealed in a book for decades. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. The keeper's cottage was one large room, maybe 20 feet by 15. The floor was wide pine planks, warped and buckled in places but solid underneath. Against the far wall stood a cast-iron wood stove, its pipe still rising through the ceiling. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with no mattress pushed into the corner, and every surface, every wall, every inch of visible space was covered in dust so thick it looked like grey velvet. But the room was not empty. That was the first thing that made Frank's breath catch. On the table, arranged in a neat row, sat 7 glass jars. They were mason jars, the old kind with wire bale lids, and they were filled with something dark. Frank walked closer. His boots left prints in the dust like footprints on the moon. He picked up the first jar and held it to the light coming through the open door. The glass was cloudy, but he could see inside. Seeds. Each jar was filled with seeds, carefully dried and labeled with tiny strips of paper. He could make out the faded handwriting. Tomato, brandy wine, bean, scarlet runner, squash, blue Hubbard, lettuce, butter crunch. Each label had a year written underneath. 1959, 1960, 1961. His grandfather had saved seeds. The last year on the labels was 1961, the year the lighthouse was decommissioned, the year Gerald Mercer had supposedly walked away from this place and never returned. But there was more. Behind the wood stove, Frank found a door he had not noticed at first. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, cut into the stone wall and fitted with a latch that had been hand-forged from iron. He worked the latch. The door opened onto a narrow spiral staircase that wound upward into the lighthouse tower itself. He climbed. The stairs were iron, bolted to the interior wall, and each step rang like a bell under his weight. The sound echoed up and up, swirling in the cylinder of stone. His legs burned, his back seized with each turn of the spiral, but something pulled him upward, something beyond curiosity, something that felt closer to recognition. Like he had been climbing these stairs his entire life in dreams he could never remember upon waking. At the top, the gallery room opened up. The old Fresnel lens was gone, removed decades ago, but the glass windows of the lantern room were still intact, every pane. The view was staggering. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out in every direction, grey and endless, smashing itself white against the rocks below. The horizon was a knife line between water and sky. He could see 3 islands to the east, low and dark and forested, and to the north the coastline curved away in a series of rocky points and hidden coves that looked untouched by anything human. And in the center of that lantern room, on the floor where the lens had once stood, was a wooden chest. It was a sea chest, the kind sailors used. Oak, banded with brass that had turned green. It was about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and latched with a simple hook. No lock. Frank knelt beside it. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. He lifted the latch. He opened the chest. Inside was a life. There were letters, dozens of them, maybe 100, tied in bundles with twine. There were photographs, black and white, curling at the edges. There was a leather journal, thick as a Bible, its pages swollen with moisture. There was a folded American flag, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a Navy service record book with the name Gerald T. Mercer printed on the front. Frank sat on the cold iron floor of that lantern room, the wind howling against the glass, the sea roaring below, and he opened his grandfather's journal to the first page. The entry was dated June 4th, 1945. It began, "I have come home from the war, and I do not know how to be a person anymore." Frank could not read any further. Not then. He pressed the journal to his chest, and he wept for the first time in years, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body, because he recognized those words. They were his own words. They were the words he had never been able to say. The first 2 weeks in the lighthouse nearly killed him. The wood stove worked, but the chimney was partially blocked with bird nests, and the first night he lit a fire, the cottage filled with smoke so thick he had to crawl to the door on his hands and knees. He slept on the bare pine floor with his sleeping bag, and woke up so stiff he had to roll onto his stomach and push himself up like a man doing a push-up, because his back would not bend. There was no running water. He melted snow in a pot on the wood stove and carried water from a creek 1/2 mile inland. He had no food except what he could carry from the gas station on Route 1, and the walk there and back took most of a day. Then the town found out about him. It started with a man named Dale Prescott, who owned 40 acres adjacent to the lighthouse property and had been eyeing it for years. Dale showed up on the 8th day, driving a Ford truck that he parked where the road ended, and walked the rest of the way in with a face like a man delivering bad news. He was 55, square-jawed, with the permanent sunburn of someone who worked lobster boats. He stood in Frank's doorway and said, "I was going to buy that lighthouse. I had an agreement with the county. You were not supposed to be here. Frank said, I have the deed. Dale said, a deed does not mean much out here. This point floods in nor'easters. The cliff is eroding. In 10 years, this whole structure will be in the ocean. You paid $800 for a grave. He left without saying goodbye, but the next morning, Frank found a note nailed to his door. It was not from Dale. It was from the Seal Harbor Historic Preservation Committee, informing him that the lighthouse was under consideration for historic designation and that no alterations could be made to the structure without approval. The letter was signed by the committee chair. Her name was Dale Prescott's wife, Martha. Frank understood. They wanted him gone. The lighthouse, the land, the view, they wanted it for themselves, and an old homeless veteran with no money and no connections was not going to be the one who kept it. That night, he almost left. He sat on the floor of the cottage with the wood stove dying and the cold creeping in through every crack in the stone, and he thought about how easy it would be. Just walk away. Leave the crowbar and the sleeping bag and the dead man's chest of letters. Walk back to Portland, back to the overpass, back to the slow, frozen process of disappearing. No one would notice. No one would care. Claire would never know. Linda would never know. He would simply become another number, another statistic, another veteran who fell through the cracks and was swallowed by them. He picked up his grandfather's journal. He opened it at random. The entry was from September 1952. Gerald had been keeping the lighthouse for 7 years by then. The entry said, "The inspector from Augusta came today and told me this light serves no purpose. He said, ships have radar now. He said I am redundant. I told him the light is not for the ships. It is for me. As long as I keep it burning, I know I am still here. I know I still matter to someone, even if that someone is a stranger on a boat I will never see." Frank closed the journal. He fed the last of his firewood into the stove. He did not leave. The next morning, he began to work. He started with the chimney. He climbed onto the roof of the cottage, which was slate and treacherous with ice, and he cleared the bird nests by hand, reaching down into the flue with his arm until his shoulder ached, and his skin was black with soot. He found 4 nests, a dead crow, and a glass bottle that had somehow wedged itself halfway down. When he pulled it out, he saw there was a rolled piece of paper inside it. He did not open it yet. He put it on the table next to the seed jars and kept working. He patched the windows with plywood scraps he found in a collapsed shed behind the cottage. He tightened the stovepipe with wire. He found that the hand pump in the kitchen, a cast-iron pitcher pump that he had assumed was decorative, still connected to a well beneath the cottage. The leather seals were rotted, but the mechanism worked. He fashioned new seals from strips cut from his belt, and after 40 minutes of pumping, brown water coughed up through the spout, then cleared to something almost clean. He had water. Weeks passed. The snow began to thin. Frank worked from dawn until his body forced him to stop, which was usually around 2 in the afternoon, when his back locked up and his hands cramped so badly he could not grip a tool. He scavenged materials from the collapsed shed, from driftwood on the shore, from the dump behind the gas station, where the teenager with the Patriot's hoodie started saving useful things for him. An old mattress, a tarp, 3 cans of exterior paint, mismatched colors that someone had thrown away half full. By the 3rd week, the cottage had a working stove, a pump with clean water, a door that sealed against the wind, and windows that let in light instead of rain. It was not beautiful. It was not even comfortable. But it was his. He read Gerald's journal at night by candlelight. His grandfather's story assembled itself piece by piece, like a man walking out of fog. Gerald Mercer had enlisted in the Navy at 17, fought in the Pacific, seen things at Okinawa that he could not write about directly, but that surfaced in the margins, in drawings, in single words underlined so hard the pen had torn the paper. He came home in 1945 and could not hold a job, could not stay in a room with more than 3 people, could not sleep without the sound of water. He applied for the lighthouse keeper position in 1947. He got it because no one else wanted it. He had lived here for 14 years. Alone. But not entirely alone. The letters in the chest told another story. They were addressed to a woman named Miriam. Frank did not recognize the name. The letters were written in Gerald's hand, but never sent. Each one was sealed, stamped, addressed, and placed back in the chest. Love letters, all of them. Detailed, specific, aching with tenderness. Gerald wrote about the way the light hit the water at 4 in the afternoon. He wrote about the sound of seals on the rocks below. He wrote about planting a garden in the thin soil behind the cottage and how the tomatoes tasted like the sun itself. He wrote, "I have not told Carl about you. I do not know how to explain that his mother was not the only person I loved. I do not know how to explain that love does not work the way they told us it should." Frank set the letters down. Carl was his father. Miriam was not his grandmother. His grandfather had loved someone else, someone secret, someone he could never send a letter to. And his father, Carl, had known, or suspected. That was why he had called Gerald a fool. That was why he never spoke of him. Not because Gerald was a hermit, but because Gerald had a secret that Carl could not forgive. By the 2nd month, the cottage was livable. Not comfortable by any modern standard, but warm and dry and solid. Frank had patched the roof. He had sanded the pine floor until it glowed honey gold in the candlelight. He had built a shelf from driftwood and placed the seed jars on it in a row, their dark contents visible through the cloudy glass, like specimens in a museum. The teenager from the gas station, whose name was Marcus, started coming out on weekends. He brought food, batteries, a transistor radio that only picked up one station. He did not ask Frank many questions. He just showed up and worked alongside him, holding boards while Frank hammered, fetching water, clearing brush from what had once been the garden. Marcus was 17. He lived with his grandmother. His parents were, in his words, not in the picture. One Saturday, Marcus brought an old woman with him. She was small and bird-boned, with white hair cut short and eyes the color of sea glass. Her name was Dot. She was Marcus's grandmother, and she was 89 years old. She walked the 4.5 miles from Route 1 without complaint, though Frank could see it cost her. She stood in the doorway of the cottage and looked at the seed jars on the shelf and pressed her hand to her mouth and said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "Those are Miriam's seeds." Frank felt the floor shift beneath him. He said, "You knew her." Dot sat down at the table, in one of the 2 chairs that Gerald Mercer had built with his own hands 65 years ago. She said, "Miriam was my sister." The story came out slowly, the way cold honey pours. Miriam had lived in Seal Harbor her whole life. She had never married. She had worked at the post office, and every week for 14 years she had walked out to Herring Point to visit the lighthouse keeper. The town knew. The town talked. But Miriam did not care, and Gerald did not care, and for 14 years they had a love that existed outside of every structure the world had built to contain such things. When the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1961, Gerald was told to leave. He refused. They cut his pay. He still refused. Finally, in the winter of 1962, The Coast Guard sent men to physically remove him. Gerald left that night before they arrived. He left everything behind: the furniture, the stove, the seed jars, the chest of letters. He walked to Miriam's house in the middle of a snowstorm and stood on her porch and said, "I have nowhere to go." Miriam took him in. They lived together for 12 years, quietly, in a small house on the back side of town. Gerald never recovered from leaving the lighthouse. His mind dimmed slowly, like a filament burning out. He died in 1974, the year Frank was born, in Miriam's arms, in a bed that faced a window that faced the sea. Dot said, "Miriam kept the deed. She paid the taxes every year out of her post office salary for decades. She died in 2003. I took over the taxes after that. But I am 89 now, and I could not keep going. When the county said they would auction it, I asked them to send the notice to you. Frank said, 'It was you.' The handwritten note." Dot said, "Miriam made me promise. She said if there was ever a mercer who needed it, the light should come home to them." Spring arrived like a held breath finally released. The snow melted. The creek behind the cottage swelled and sang over its stones. The bare trees hazed green, then burst into leaf almost overnight. And Frank, on an April morning so warm he could work in his shirt sleeves for the first time, took the 7 jars of seeds down from the shelf and carried them outside. He did not know if seeds could survive 65 years. Everything he had read at the Seal Harbor Library, where the librarian had let him use a computer, said no. Seeds lose viability. After a decade, most are dead. After 6 decades, the odds were essentially 0. He planted them anyway. He turned the soil in the garden plot behind the cottage with a spade Marcus had brought him. The soil was thin and rocky, but beneath the first 6 inches it was dark and rich, composted by decades of fallen leaves and sea spray. He opened each jar carefully. The seeds were dry and light and smelled like nothing at all. He placed them in rows, the way the labels described, and covered them with soil and watered them from the hand pump and stood back and waited. Nothing happened for 3 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early May, Frank walked out to the garden and found a single green shoot pushing through the dark earth. It was where he had planted the Brandywine tomatoes. He knelt beside it, his bad knee grinding against the ground, and he touched the tiny leaf with one finger. It was real. It was alive. It had waited 65 years in a glass jar in an abandoned lighthouse, and it had come back. By June, the garden was a riot of green. Not everything survived. The lettuce never sprouted. The beans came up sparse and weak. But the tomatoes, the squash, and something unlabeled from the 7th jar that turned out to be sunflowers, they grew like they were making up for lost time. The sunflowers reached 6 feet by July, their golden faces turning to follow the light. And Frank stood among them and felt something he could not name. It was not happiness exactly. It was something older and quieter than happiness. It was the feeling of being in the right place. The town began to change around him. Dale Prescott came back in June, not with threats, but with lumber. He stood at the edge of the clearing with his truck loaded with 2x4s and said, "My wife says I was a horse's rear end. She is usually right. Can I help?" Frank looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I need to rebuild the gallery railing." Dale nodded and started unloading. The Historic Preservation Committee, which turned out to be 4 people who met in Martha Prescott's living room, approved every change Frank had made and offered to help him apply for a restoration grant. The grant came through in August, $12,000. Frank used it to rewire the cottage, install a solar panel, and replace the cracked panes in the lantern room. He moved Gerald's sea chest down from the tower and placed it at the foot of his bed. At night, he read the unsent letters to Miriam. He read about a man who had found the one place in the world where his broken mind could rest, and the one person who made that rest feel like living rather than hiding. He read about a man who planted seeds every year, because the act of putting something in the ground and trusting it to grow was the closest thing to faith he had left. In September, Frank opened the bottle he had found in the chimney. The paper inside was brittle and yellowed, and he unrolled it with the care of a man handling something sacred. It was not a letter. It was a deed. A second deed, older than the one for the lighthouse. It was dated 1923, and it was for 47 acres surrounding the lighthouse property, extending from the cliffs inland to the tree line. The land that Dale Prescott had always assumed was his. The land that had never been properly surveyed or transferred. The land that, according to this document, still belonged to the Mercer family. Frank did not use this information the way some people might have. He did not hire a lawyer. He did not make demands. He went to Dale Prescott's house on a Sunday morning and sat at his kitchen table and showed him the deed and said, "I do not want your land, Dale. I just want you to know that this place was not an accident. My grandfather chose it. He stayed for a reason, and I am going to stay for the same reason." Dale Prescott looked at the deed for a very long time. Then he looked at Frank, and his eyes were wet. He said, "My father used to talk about the lighthouse keeper. He said the man was the bravest person he ever knew, living out there alone. I never understood what he meant until now." October came, and with it, the kind of Maine autumn that makes the whole world look like it is on fire. The maples along the creek blazed red and orange. The ocean turned from grey to a deep, impossible blue. And Frank harvested his grandfather's tomatoes, 65 years after they were sealed in glass, and ate one standing in the garden with the juice running down his chin and the salt wind in his hair. And the taste was so sweet and so alive that he had to sit down on the ground because his legs would not hold him. That evening, he wrote a letter. It was addressed to Claire Mercer at the last address he had for her in a suburb of Denver. He did not ask her to forgive him. He did not explain where he had been or what had happened to him. He wrote about the lighthouse. He wrote about the garden. He wrote about the seeds that had survived 65 years in the dark and still remembered how to grow. He wrote, "I am not asking you to come. I am just telling you that there is a light on in case you ever need to find your way to shore." He sealed the letter. He stamped it. He walked it to the mailbox on Route 1. And then he walked back to the lighthouse, 4.5 miles along the dirt road through the bare November trees, his breath making clouds, his back aching, his knee grinding, his heart doing something it had not done in years. It was beating toward something instead of away from it. The first snow of winter fell on a Thursday night in late November. Frank sat in the lantern room at the top of the tower, in a chair he had carried up the spiral stairs, one painful step at a time. The gallery windows were clear now, every pane restored, and through them he could see the snow falling on the black water, dissolving the instant it touched the surface. The solar panel powered a single bulb, and he had placed it in the lantern room where the old Fresnel lens had been. It was not bright. It could not guide a ship. But from the shore, from the road, from anywhere along that dark stretch of coast, you could see it. A small, steady light, burning in a place the world had forgotten. Below him, the cottage was warm. The wood stove ticked and sighed. The seed jars, refilled now with seeds from his own harvest, sat on the driftwood shelf in a neat row, waiting for spring. Gerald's journal lay open on the table. beside a new journal that Frank had started, in which he wrote about the tides and the weather, and the way the light changed with the seasons, continuing a record his grandfather had begun 79 years earlier. He did not know if Claire would write back. He did not know if the grant money would last. He did not know if the cliff would hold, or the storms would come, or the winter would be kind. But he knew this. He knew that his grandfather had once stood in this exact spot, looking out at this same black water, and had chosen to stay. Not because the world needed him, not because anyone was watching, but because the act of keeping a light burning in the darkness was its own kind of purpose, its own kind of prayer. Frank Mercer, 63 years old, veteran, formerly homeless, owner of an $800 lighthouse on a crumbling cliff in Maine, reached over and adjusted the bulb so it shone a little brighter through the glass. Then he sat back, and he watched the snow fall on the ocean, and he waited for morning. Some lights are not for the ships. Some lights are for the keeper, and sometimes the most abandoned place in the world turns out to be the only place where a forgotten man can finally remember who he was always supposed to be.